Hi everyone, welcome back to Causality with Boris, broadcast from SobolevSpaces. In this video, I talk about counterfactual queries, counterfactual reasoning, attributable proportion, necessary and sufficient causes are the three main topics of today's lesson. And I encourage you to watch it to the end, so you can see the counterfactual queries in a meaningful public health context. You can find more information on the website in the description. We see treatment and outcomes occurring together. How do we know their occurrence is causal? We perform a causal analysis. Our analytical tools are simple but powerful. We examine causal diagrams, we apply the backdoor criterion, we identify adjustment factors. We stratify observations on them. Stratification by variables from the backdoor criterion provides a double safeguard. Within each stratum, the stratification variables cannot be responsible for variation in treatment and outcome. And if they satisfy the backdoor criterion, their fixed values will block all other influences, including those that may create an association between treatment and outcome. Then we find treatment effects using the adjustment formulas. And much of the literature on the treatment effects revolves around this approach. Focus is always on refining regression models. And why not? Conceptually, it's still stratification. However, there is another line of causal reasoning. Lewis, another titan of causality, observes a link between the language of causality and the language of counterfactual conditions. It boils down to a single phrase. If A happened, then B would happen. In this sentence, A did not happen, and considering it is counterfactual. In fact, Lewis rediscovers Hume definitions of cause. We are constantly citing the first part of that definition. Cause must be an object followed by another object, and where all objects like the first follow objects like the second. Lewis draws our attention to the second part of this definition. If the first of the two objects did not exist, neither would the second. Sounds complicated. It turns out not only it's legit, but considering counterfactual conditions is the essence of causal reasoning. We are constantly running into what-if questions. We look at possible alternatives to events that already occurred, and we imagine how the outcome might have changed if preceding events had been different. I take aspirin and headache goes away. I wonder, what if I hadn't taken the aspirin? Would have my headache gone away? What-if questions involve counterfactual reasoning. We are asking whether outcome would have been different if treatment had been different. And these questions cannot be answered with data alone. And many stop here. Pearl argues that there is a link to data. Let's see what he says. We observe outcome and treatment occurring together. Then we ask, what is the probability that outcome wouldn't have occurred in the absence of treatment? So, to conclude that X causes Y, we looked at the probability that Y would change should X take a different value than it did. This kind of reasoning is common in public health. It places concerns about harmful exposures in a meaningful context. It allows measuring the burden of exposure in disease frequency in the population. And the measure we study in epidemiology classes is attributable proportion. It's a measure of the public health impact of harmful exposure. Its calculation starts with the occurrence of disease in the unexposed population. That's the baseline risk. Then we compare it with the risk in the exposed group. The difference between them is attributed to the exposure. Using a simple algebra, we find the proportion of diseases in the exposed attributable to the exposure. We think of the attributable proportion as the expected reduction in disease if exposure is eliminated. We use the counterfactual language and say some cases of disease would not have occurred if the population had been protected against the exposure. This proportion is what Pearl calls the probability of disablement. In his language, disablement means the expectation that absence of exposure would have prevented outcome when we observe that the outcome has occurred. In that sense, the attributable proportion estimates the probability that observed cases would not have occurred if the population had not been exposed. Attributable proportion is a classical counterfactual in epidemiology. Pearl offers other counterfactuals. He argues they help answer various public health questions. Let's change our focus a bit and move from disablement to necessity. Necessity in his language refers to the expectations that absence of exposure prevents outcome. And here is a shift from disablement when we observe that exposure and outcome occur together. So it's a necessary cause, really. The probability of necessity could be thought of as the proportion of the exposed cases that would have been prevented in the absence of exposure. That is, we looked at exposure and outcome occurring together, and we asked to what extent eliminating the exposure would have prevented the outcome. Interested in the opposite situation, we turn to the other two counterfactuals. What is the opposite of disablement? It's enablement, right? Enablement refers to the hypothesis that the presence of exposure would produce outcome when we observe no outcome. By analogy, we can extend the notion of enablement to sufficiency. Sufficiency refers to the expectations that the presence of exposure leads to outcome. Again, important clause, when exposure and outcome do not occur together. Another point, I would call it susceptibility rather than sufficiency. In this sense, the probability of susceptibility is the proportion of cases among unexposed had the exposure been present. We observe cases in which there is no exposure, there is no outcome, and then we ask how many of them would have outcomes if the exposure were present. There are two interesting examples from clinical practice. Imagine that we are comparing two treatments. If interested in the necessary cause, we find the proportion of patients who would have survived if they had received the other treatment. That is, we looked at patients who received one treatment and died, and then we ask how many would have survived if treatment were different. If interested in sufficient cause, we looked at the proportion of patients who would have died if they had received a different treatment. That is, we see that patients received one treatment, and then we ask what is their risk of death would have been if treatment were different. Let's apply this to treatments of heart disease. In a large observational study, 𝗖𝘂𝘀𝗶𝘁𝗵 and colleagues compare long-term survival after bypass surgery and after angioplasty with stenting. They looked at 80,000 patients after surgery and almost 104,000 patients after angioplasty. Patients are 65 or older with 2 and 3 vessel disease, treated in 600 hospitals between 2004 and 2007. Comparing these two treatments, 𝗖𝘂𝘀𝗶𝘁𝗵 finds a better long-term survival after bypass surgery. And this is where most observational studies would end. Yet without further reasoning, we cannot attribute difference in survival to treatment choice. Other factors can be at play. And without causal analysis, we cannot conclude that the patient population may benefit from choosing surgery over angioplasty. But comparing outcomes of two treatments is not an end in itself. Rather, it is about informing clinical decision-making. In public health, policymakers are often interested in the risk reduction that will be achieved by reducing exposure. In clinical settings, they are interested in reducing mortality by replacing inappropriate treatments. When we looked at the Weintraub study, Pearl's approach places these questions in a meaningful context. If we are interested in attributing survival advantage to treatment choice, we should find the proportion of angioplasty patients who would have survived if they had surgery. That is, we looked at patients who underwent angioplasty and died, and then asked how many would have survived if they had bypass surgery instead. Or we can focus on patients who had surgery. If interested in susceptibility, and I'll remind you, susceptibility refers to expectations that exposure leads to outcome among those who have not been exposed and had no outcome. So, if interested in susceptibility, we should find the proportion of surgical patients who would have died if they had angioplasty. We look at patients who were operated on and remained alive, and ask what their risk of death would have been if they had angioplasty instead. These are just two examples to help us understand what questions to ask. Pearl shows that answers to causal questions are not limited to randomized trials. Rather, it's our ability to consider existing knowledge about factors at play. We use the subject matter knowledge and determine adjustment factors. But more than that, we speculate about new counterfactual quantities that we can find from observational data. Here is the main message of this video. To conclude that X causes Y, we have to look at whether the probability of Y would have changed if X had taken a different value than it actually did. You learned that the necessary cause refers to the expectations that the absence of exposure will prevent outcome when we observe that exposure and outcome occur together. You learned that the sufficient cause refers to the hypothesis that the presence of exposure will lead to outcome when we observe that exposure and outcome do not occur together. Check out our website. It will direct you to resources on causal reasoning and health services research. The link is in the description. You watched another episode of Causality with Boris. Keep on watching.